Good morning, Dublin. Welcome back. I'm going to give an introduction now for Dr. Len Fleischer, who's going to give us a presentation. We'll do the presentation and then have time for Q&A. For the question and answer, what we're going to do is we're going to set up mics on either side because this is being live streamed, so we want the audience to be able to hear it. So if you have questions, you can line up there. And then after we finish with the Q&A, then we'll have time for announcements after that. So if you have announcements, hold on to that. So here we go. Good to see you all. Dr. Len Fleischer has dedicated his life to supporting young people finding their truth. His career trajectory encompasses the fields of education and psychology from Colorado to New England. Len is a clinical psychologist who has taught on the undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level. Len cares deeply about emotional and spiritual healing, as it has been a tenet of his life's work. For 3 decades, he focused on adolescent mentoring, guiding rites of passage, and coming-of-age experiences. In addition to his private practice of 2 decades, Len served at the region as a school counselor, and he was Dublin's adolescent counselor for several years in the 90s. Recently, Len has broadened his work to explore collective and intergenerational trauma and healing. Today's Inspires will focus on Len's return to one of humanity's darkest chapters, a trip to the concentration camps in Europe to witness in empathy, seeking to extract light from even the darkest past. Len is a teacher, storyteller, community leader, empathic witness, a friend, and one of the people I admire most in the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Len Fleischer this morning.
Can you hear me? Hi, Douglas. How are you? I was here in the 90s, and there are still a few people that were here back then that are here right now. Mr. Harrison over there, and Ms. Dunmez, where are you? There she is. And have I missed anybody? I don't want to leave anybody out, but the rest of us will get to know each other today. What do you say? I taught a class here my last year in 2001 called Senior Passage. And it was for seniors, but really I think of it as being for all Dublin school students. And we had some people come in, and the class was about the psychological, emotional, and spiritual transformation that can happen on the way to authentic adulthood, genuine adulthood. And I think of Dublin School as a really special place, I mean this, where that kind of transformation to authentic adulthood is nurtured. So I just want to say, oh, there's one more person here. I can't see her. Ilaria, where are you? There she is. Ilaria and I worked together something called the Menana Interfaith Project, and she, for me, is a real wonderful representative of your school, doing big work. So I'm glad you're here too. So let's dive in. I'll begin with some relevant information about my ancestry. My maternal grandparents escaped from anti-Jewish pogroms, you know that word? In what is now Ukraine, seeking freedom in Austria. The pogroms were organized ethnic cleansing killing sprees in the early part of last century, before World War I. My parents were born in Vienna, Austria, during World War I, just barely escaped as the Holocaust and World War II began. Many members of their extended family did not make it out. I am actually, I carry the name of my mother's great uncle who said it would blow over. He and many other of my ancestors did not survive. And I have had relatives all over the world who desperately sought asylum in China, Argentina, Canada, Palestine, New Zealand, and the US. I'm a first-generation American with an ancestral trauma history of people exiled, enslaved, and exterminated that literally goes back thousands of years. Someone who did survive the Holocaust in Europe and was granted an asylum in the US was my mother. A documentary, Überleben. Anybody know German? Survivor, right? Überleben means survivor, thank you. Was made about her return in the 1970s to where she grew up and left in 1939. It tells the story of her very cautious return to Vienna. We see her nervously approaching the apartment where she had lived, which was over the tailor shop of her father, my grandfather. Over the course of several visits, we see that she develops a connection with the radio shop owner who had renovated that tailor shop where she worked as a seamstress as an adolescent in the 1930s. My mom used to come to Keene State College, where there's a Cohen Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, to tell the story of that connection after the trauma that she and my dad had experienced. My mom died a few years ago at the age of 101, so clearly she was more than just a survivor. Maybe we can call her a thriver, a person who found a way to bring light after the darkness that she experienced. This is my mom. That's Vienna.
Ich bin auf einer Bank gesessen auf der Towerstraße und habe den Kindern zugeschaut, wie sie gespielt haben. Und ich hätte weinen können, dass die Kinder, sie haben nicht gewusst und sie haben gespielt wie jedes amerikanisches Kind. Und ich habe zu mir allein gesprochen und habe gesagt, warum hat uns unsere Jugend so geändert mit dem Hass, den er versucht hat, in uns zu instillieren. Und es dauert viele Jahre, um es to get rid of it.
She was 20 when she came to the United States. My parents married in Vienna, Austria, their home on July 3rd, 1938. As they emerged from the synagogue, there were a number of my father's non-Jewish friends standing there to congratulate the newlyweds, or so he thought. So they're in their wedding clothes, and instead, Austria had recently been annexed by the German regime. And these Austrian citizens, to varying degrees, were complicit in the Nazi mandate to harass, intimidate, and dehumanize their Jewish friends and neighbors. My father told me that he was handed a brush to scrub the street in a pail of soapy water, to scrub the street under the derisive mockery of people who were once his friends. Here's a photo of that common practice on the streets of pre-war Vienna. That is not my father, but imagine him being in his wedding clothes and being forced to do that in front of the crowd, and you could see the Hitler salute and all that. So my parents told me that everything changed overnight. It was actually, there was later that year in 1938, there was what was known as Kristallnacht. Have you ever heard of that? The Night of Broken Glass. And then it was a race for them to get out. So this is my mother's reflection on needing to leave after seeing firsthand Hitler's frightening takeover of her homeland. This is again from Oberlin.
Der Völkerstreit oder Hass untereinander, wird gepflegt von ganz bestimmten Interessenten.
That is
Es
Hitler
ist
talking.
eine kleine, wurzellose internationale Clique, die die Völker gegeneinander hetzt. Die nicht will, dass sie zur Ruhe kommen. Es sind das die Menschen, die überall und nirgends zu Hause sind, die nirgends einen Boden haben, auf den sie gewachsen sind, sondern die heute in Berlin leben, morgen genauso gut in Brüssel sein können, übermorgen in Paris oder in Prag oder in Wien oder in London und die sich überall zu Hause fühlen. Es sind die einzigen, die wirklich als internationale Elemente anzusprechen sind, weil sie überall ihre Geschäfte betätigen können. Aber das Volk kann ihnen ja nicht nachfolgen. Das Volk ist ja gekettet an seinem Boden, ist ja gekettet an seine Heimat, ist ja gebunden an die Lebensmöglichkeiten seines Staates, der Nation.
Wenn Hitler ist einmarschiert, hat es uns sehr klar geworden, dass wir waren nicht willkommen, in Wien zu bleiben.
I was born a few years after World War II to two refugee parents who were just youth group friends. But they married in order to save my father's life. As my mother had a rare visa that could include a married partner, as they sought asylum in the U.S. It's a longer story than I can go into right now, but I remember as a child the terrible effects of the psychological and physical trauma to my parents, our extended family, our refugee neighborhood in New York City. The nightmares, the anxiety, the panic attacks, the challenged parenting, but I did not understand it. I was a kid. I felt like an accidental child, a stranger in a strange land, and I seemed to carry their trauma inside of me. As an adolescent, when I was your age, I felt like I had to figure it out. How something that seemed like it was the essence of evil haunted my grandparents, my parents, and now me, and my siblings. I read a lot about the Holocaust, heard the stories of my relatives, tried to understand the nightmares, the fear, the anxiety, the rage, the depression, and the survivor stories, often limited or held within, unspoken. This is what they grew up with. As we grew up, they warned us that the same thing could happen right here in the United States. This is what they had to deal with. This is what I had to deal with. I was taught to stay small, be careful and contained and fearful, and try not to draw too much attention to myself, lest I be victimized and dehumanized the way that they were. In the decades following the Holocaust, researchers have observed that the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were frequently afflicted with significant levels of post-traumatic disorders, depression, and anxiety. It was initially thought that these transmissions were both environmental and behavioral, in essence, that they were just learned. Researchers are now finding that the transmission of transgenerational trauma can also be due to what are known as epigenetic effects, which are changes to gene expression by non-genetic factors. This has been found in the second and now third generation offspring of victims as well as perpetrators. These studies are revealing a powerful insight that the consequences of trauma are passed down the line and are able to impact the lives of descendants well removed from the original traumatic experience. It's likely this is why I became a psychologist, focusing on children, adolescents, and families. Over the years, I learned a lot from people about the pain of trauma, how it limits and even psychologically paralyzes individuals, families, societal groups, and can keep us insecure, anxious, frozen, small. I began to see how no one really gets out of childhood without some kind of wound, some more traumatic than others. But we all seem to carry that pain in our unconscious, in our emotional reactivity, and in our bodies, and it limits us. And that traumatic experience, that great psychic wound in the refugee community of survivors in Brooklyn, where I grew up, was all about the extermination of an entire group of people just a few years before, my ancestors, in what was called by the Nazis the final solution to the Jewish question. Here's a building at Auschwitz I, the first concentration camp, devoted to the details of how it was done. That's where the original plan was first carried out. That final solution was meticulously planned, logistically precise, highly efficient, and ruthlessly enacted. It was a mass deportation that led to a mass extermination. And it almost worked. Out of the 9 million Jews living in Europe prior to World War II, the Nazis killed more than 2/3 of them, 6 million. And more than 1 million at Auschwitz itself, including 200,000 children. So the soon-to-be murdered are seen here arriving. Wore yellow stars that you can see to identify them. Now a large group of women are lined up for selection, heads shaved, selected either to be murdered or assigned to slave labor. People were brought here in a conveyance made for animals. And they were housed for their likely brief stay before being exterminated in housing like this. At the outset of the pandemic, a colleague led me to an international Zoom group entitled The Legacy of the Holocaust for Germans and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians. I became aware of research being done on what is known as collective trauma, meaning whole groups of people in their respective cultures, both victims and perpetrators. And I came to understand what is known as transgenerational trauma, how collective trauma can be passed down to offspring, socially, emotionally, epigenetically. I also learned about witnessing, developed through deep listening, radical acceptance, unconditional compassion, and being fully present as people tell their story, tell their deeply personal, individual, and collective trauma stories. At the end of our Zoom group on the legacy of the Holocaust, I became aware of something called witnessing and empathy, which went to another level, from virtual to real, a journey to Berlin, Germany, and Auschwitz, Poland, the site of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, for the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, as well as Nazis, addressing collective and transgenerational trauma. This may sound strange, and I didn't really understand it about myself at the time, but it was an instant yes. I knew I had to do it. It felt like a pilgrimage to a place that had haunted me, especially in my dreams, since I was a child. Our witnessing and empathy group started out online, telling each other our childhood stories, what we experienced as we grew up with victims and perpetrators, telling each other what we saw and heard, and that which stayed in the shadows that was left unsaid. We learned to witness, which is listening with an open heart and mind to each other. Taking in each other's pain felt like a kind of sacred witness as we extended ourselves to the other. If a person or a community is traumatized, scared, in pain, it seems to me that it's a sacred obligation, a calling to witness the harm they've been through, to fully empathize with their experience. We met for the first time in person in Berlin, Germany in May of 2023. I was quite anxious going there to literally what had been the Nazi belly of the beast. For a significant portion of my life, I had been terrified of Germans. What I found there surprised me and moved me, a very public accountability and responsibility on the part of post-war German governments and people for the sins of their past. All over Berlin, there were monuments, remembrances, markers, signs of what had been done to exterminate Jewish and other life in Europe. I learned from the Germans in our group that they were deeply traumatized by their complicit and perpetrator parents and grandparents, and they carried deep pain and rage and shame. We walked through a neighborhood in Berlin where Albert Einstein used to live, and there were all these signs declaring the Nazi race laws, which began in 1933 after Hitler's ascension to power. So we're in this neighborhood, and there are these big, colorful flags, and on the other side there's a listing of the Nazi race laws, and you can see them starting in 1933. It's relatively benign, and then it gets heavier and heavier. I walked through this neighborhood, saw these signs, and it felt like I was a 10-year-old. Just experienced viscerally what it must have felt like to be a 10-year-old kid in Berlin, to find out that I could no longer go to my chess club, the swimming pool, our favorite bakery, my beloved school, and eventually, inexorably deported from my home. With public accountability like this, it struck me that the Germans were actively and intentionally coming to terms with their horrific history in ways that we in the U.S. could learn from, engage with, relative to our own history of perpetrating slavery and genocide of Native people in our own country. In the center of Berlin, not far from the Brandenburg Gate, and across the street from the American Embassy, is the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. That's what it's called. It's like a gigantic graveyard, 2 acres, right in the heart of Berlin. And here is what's known as a Stoppelstein. You see that? You see these all over Berlin, all over Germany, actually all over Europe. This is a marker of a person who lived right there. And it says in German, she died in Auschwitz. She was deported from her home. And this is right in front of a simple little home or apartment building. You see these all over the streets of Berlin. And a museum window in Berlin, which is another kind of remembrance. Within our group of Germans and Jews who shared Holocaust ancestry of perpetrators and victims, we had deep dialogues about how those roles lived in our families and in our psyches. We actively listened to each other's stories, witnessing, empathizing with each other's trauma and grief and hope. We got very close, and we became resources to one another. We went back to Berlin in October 2023, a few days after the Hamas attack on Israel. That was a coincidence of the calendar, but we felt called to respond, to witness. We continued learning about what the Germans called the topography of terror in pursuit of the final solution. And also we witnessed at a Berlin synagogue where there was a terrorist firebombing about 10 days after the Hamas attack in Israel. In silent meditation, we tried to encircle the damage, the wounded place. The bombing was right where those poles are. And we stood around this man who was holding his sign. The next day, we took the train from Berlin to Auschwitz, where more than 1 million people were systematically exterminated, including all those children. Terrified as I was, I knew it was a journey that had started when I was a kid, trying to understand my ancestral trauma, and the next step needed to be where the horror actually happened, where the ashes of my ancestors were. There it is, and there's a train track coming right in. We spent 5 days there. At this gigantic, it is 15 square miles, planned, or engineered, organized, highly efficient factory of death. We sat in silent witness at the gas chambers, the crematoria, the ash pond. We held each other, we wept, we witnessed what had happened here. It is a gigantic, open wound. We saw it can't be denied. These shoes and more were taken from people as they went into the showers. Wheelchairs, crutches of disabled people. This was all taken from people as they undressed for what they were told were showers, but they were actually gas chambers. We were supported by each other and by these core principles of witnessing and empathy. And maybe we can just pause here for a minute so you can take it in a little bit. These principles of open heart, empathy for yourself as well as for others, openness for what emerges, are things that help us really get through it and be in this very, very difficult place. So I just want you to see that when you have this kind of support and you practice it with one another, we were able to endure and actually, at some level, emerge from this strengthened. We opened our hearts, broken and somehow expanded. And we did stay on, capable of staying human in a very dark and inhuman place. So here we are, these are members of the group, meditating at a bombed-out crematorium. The Nazis bombed their crematoria as they were retreating because they thought they didn't want to see the Allies who were liberating Auschwitz. It was actually the Russians who, to see what they had been doing. So those are the remains of the Nazis bombing their own crematorium. So we're meditating at one of the crematoria that the Nazis reduced to rubble as they retreated with the Allies approaching. It was there that I learned what the word Holocaust means. It's from the Greek, burnt offering. And there's my friend Rana, a member of our group. She's at the tree that overlooked the famous Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free sign at Auschwitz. Okay. All right. We'll find it. It's a picture of the group of us, 15 people. Okay, I can go on more.
There it is.
Okay. So there were a group of 15 of us, and we'll figure it out, we'll get it. Our witnessing and empathy group was fully immersed at Auschwitz-Birkenau for 5 days, supporting one another as we experienced the sheer evil of this horrible place, where dehumanization was the precursor to extermination. I somehow was able to, there we are. You see me? Supporting each other, as we experienced this place. I somehow was able to see how empathizing with ourselves as well as with others, even perpetrators, is a critical and essential part of what it means to be human. Every one of us is within the circle of compassion. I believe that strongly. No exceptions. Every one of us is capable of inhumanity, of acting as a perpetrator, living in that darkness. Every one of us is capable of grace, of offering our light. It is a choice. So, this is a child's tiny drawing that was found hidden in a barracks. You can see the Jewish star is being hung on a gallows as flowers are alive just beyond the gallows. In this birch grove, which is what Birkenau means, I saw this picture. Taken by the Nazis in July of 1944, of a group of newly arrived Hungarian women and children awaiting their deaths at the gas chamber at the edge of the grove. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, I'm guessing, looking out, innocent, uncomprehending, very alive, very human. Can you see her? I couldn't look away, though I wanted to. A name came to me of her, Stefania. I took her into my heart And she, her innocence, her humanity, her right to live has become a guiding light for me. This is from my journal, October 23rd, 23. It's hard to describe in words because writing is a cognitive process. What I am feeling, what I feel in my body, in my heart, in my emotions. Sitting in this place of horror, witnessing up close the gas chambers, the crematoria, the cattle cars, the selection site, the ash pond, and the children, especially the children. I'm right there. I'm living and dying with them. I'm the victim as well as the perpetrator. I see their souls. They see mine. There is no distinction. The denial, the numbness, the self-protective mechanisms melt away. Boundaries lessen. I'm just another human being going to his death and at the same time going to his life. Our shared life. Our humanity. Our soul. It is not murdered. It is alive. I see it. My heart breaks open, bleeds all over, doesn't die, it expands. I feel the little ones going up in smoke, and I see the ripples, feel them in my body. I'm not a spectator. I participate. Every nerve ending is awakened. The souls are dancing. They circle around. They lift each other up. They lift me up. It is somehow holy, somehow sacred in this hell. These beings, this being will not die. What is eternal, this awakening, this awareness, this broken open heart, this soul, this love beyond measure will never die. That light inside the dark is illuminating a path forward for me upon my return, focused on what I and what we can do in this deeply wounded world. I have carried the trauma of my ancestors across generations, and the trauma has resided in the darkest and most inaccessible places within myself. That individual and collective trauma is now accessed and known and felt up close, and it's no longer held in the dark. I see it clearly now, that sacred wound we all carry. I see it integrated and transformed. I see possibility where once it seemed like there was none. The burnt offering that somehow offers light. One important place of possibility is the ongoing situation in Israel and Gaza, what has been going on for the last 2 years, which has an ancestral trauma connection to the Holocaust, as well as what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Two traumatized peoples have actively dehumanized one another. Children have been taken as hostages, as well as bombed and killed. And the ability to see one another as human, as worthy of life, has been slipping away. I see it as deep ancestral wounding, still alive through the generations, still wreaking vengeance on one another, a seemingly endless cycle of pain and retribution. The future needs to be rooted in the truth that all human beings are equal, that Israeli and Palestinian lives, every life, is sacred, and that we can together work on a future in which nobody is oppressed. Everyone can live inside the circle of life, and we can address the inequities and ancestral wounding of the past. And that light for me, this child's light, Stefania's light, is also focused here and now in our shared community. When we consider social injustice, which is what the Holocaust was on an inconceivably monstrous scale, we can see the bias and prejudice and lack of empathy that seemingly persists in the minds and actions of those who still see the people of minorities, the others, the aliens as the problem. Those who, for generations, are seen as not like us. Jews, Muslims, Asians, Latinos, people of color, so-called illegals, poor people, gay people, trans people, disabled people, homeless people, hungry people, migrant people, people who are seen by an American presidential candidate as vermin, people who are seen as poisoning the blood, people who are called animals, people who are seen as not human. There is no future in this dark view of humanity. The bridge to the future is one another. We all belong within the circle of empathy, within the circle of witnessing. No exceptions. We all must have access to this light. I saw that sitting in the gas chamber. This is what it means to be human. Love is what it means to be human. And we can apply that understanding to our connections with one another, as well as with those we don't know, and invite them into the beloved community. Next to the death camp, we stayed at the Center for Dialogue and Prayer, run by the Catholic Church for wounded pilgrims of all faiths from all over the world. This is the place where we stayed. We sat with each other, Germans and Jews, children of perpetrators, children of victims, shared with one another our trauma and our release, our individual and collective suffering and awakening, and began to see each other in a new way, capable of coming to terms with our individual family histories, capable of reconciliation with self and family, self and others, capable of finding a new way to be in the world. For me, the Germans, whom I had loathed and been terrified of for most of my life, became my dear and deep friends. In order to have any kind of future, we have to reconcile our old trauma narratives and understand that we no longer have to be frozen and embittered by them. We can begin with the kids, with the Stefanias, take them into our hearts, see and feel their light, their life force, do all that we're able to do and then some, so that they can have a chance of living in peace and in love. And we can begin with the kid that still resides within us. I left this white rose for the little Hungarian girl who has become my guiding light. My mom had her final visit to Vienna after 60 years, about 60 years after she had to leave in order to survive. And she and her righteous Gentile friend, Leo Yosimovich, you'll see him in a minute, the shopkeeper who warmly welcomed her back to her homeland, the person who had the shop where my grandfather's tailor shop used to be, is now a radio shop. And she reflected on what had happened and how they had developed this relationship. She, a Jewish Austrian, and he, a person from, a non-Jewish person from Austria.
Hat uns ersetzt, was soll ich dir sagen? Hat uns ersetzt, was...
So she's telling, at the end of the documentary overlay that was made about her, she's telling what happened in her relationship with this man. This was really a very special relationship. I saw it when I went with my mother once to Vienna, to her home.
Hat uns ersetzt, was soll ich dir sagen? Hat uns ersetzt, was wir verloren haben.
Gave us back
Das
what
kann
we
ich
lost.
sagen. Wirklich. Und wenn mich was nach Wien gezogen hat und still das, nur ihn zu sehen.
There it is. This is in 2002.
Sie hat ihm, glaube ich, dazu beigetragen, diese Barriere überwunden, dass sie in ein fremdes, feindliches Land kommt, sondern sie hat dann nur mehr von ihrer Heimat gesprochen. Für sie war das dann scheint ein Schritt in die positive Vergangenheit, also da wollen wir sagen, ins Gedächtnis der positiven Vergangenheit, sodass sie umgeschaltet hat, ist mir vorkommen. Sie hat diese Angst und Scheu verloren, nach Österreich zu kommen.
Das Herz ist immer noch in Wien. Wirklich. Die Amerikaner, die haben genug Leid, die brauchen mich nicht.
Das ist ein Gefühl, das kann man nicht beschreiben. Das ist so, sitzt drinnen und man will, ich bin nicht imstande, das in Worte zu fassen.
Man will, aber man kann nicht.
Ich kann es nicht in Worte fassen. Man kann es nur spüren, man kann es nur sehen, aber ich kann es nicht beschreiben. Es ist ja so, ich stehe ja nicht nur da, um Geschäfte zu machen, sondern für mich ist ja das mein Lebensinhalt. Und die Vergangenheit von der Familie Fleischer ist ein Teil meines Lebensinhaltes geworden, weil es ja doch immer wieder Kontakte gegeben hat, Berührungen, Überschneidungen. So sehe ich das.
Der Mr. Jasimowitsch war mein neues Leben, meine neue Zukunft. So habe ich gehabt. I don't know if you know what chutzpah means. That means that you have nerve. Und ich habe zu ihm gesagt, können wir dann noch einen Walzer tanzen? Sagte natürlich.
Wir haben tatsächlich den Donauwalzer gesund laut und haben hier vor Geschäft, vor staunendem Publikum, da sind die Leute stehen geblieben, was ist da los? Und ich habe mit der Witzi den Donauwalzer getanzt. Und die Frau war so glücklich und ich muss sagen, das ist für mich eine der schönsten Lebenserinnerungen, dass man einem Menschen so viel Freude machen kann.
Es war fantastisch. Ich habe vergessen, am Hitler vergessen. I did.
That's my sister. And my brother. The descendants of two former generational enemies, they became the best of friends. That was my mom and her friends' truth-telling, their reconciliation, their human equity in her return to her home, expressed beautifully, dancing the Viennese waltz. So, dear Dublin students, faculty, everyone here, let's remember to tell each other our truth. Open our wounded, cloistered hearts and reconcile with ourselves, with each other, and then fully share the empathy and compassion and love we're capable of. And with that, we make a beacon of ourselves, and we share our light. Thank you.
So we're going to have these mics on at the front of the aisles here, just by the speakers, so we don't get feedback. And you're invited to come down and ask a question if you'd like.
Hi, I'm Mars. Do you think that, what do you think is the danger of the normalization of usage of language towards especially trans people in the U.S., like the calls for eradication of trans people and legislation targeting them?
What do I think about that?
What do you think about the danger of that?
I think it's extremely dangerous. It's isolating a group of people and basically saying, you really don't have a right to exist. You don't have a right to be yourself. And if there's anything that we learn from something like this, is that is extremely dangerous. It's making people less than human and therefore worthy of deportation, extermination, all those things. So I think, and I know we live in times where this is happening. It's happening right now in this country. And we have to speak out against it in the strongest possible way. What do you think?
I don't know. I've been, since freshman year, in freshman year English class here, I worked on a project comparing the legislation against trans people, this was in 2022, 2023, to stages of genocide. And I've been trying to be very outspoken against it, but it feels like trans people are becoming more and more of a political scapegoat. And it's really scary.
It is?
Yeah.
I'm with you. Thank you for asking that question. Appreciate it.
How do you believe that institutions, as opposed to individual people, can speak up for injustice, marginalized groups, and fight back against
I'm
dehumanization?
really sorry. I have really bad hearing, so I want
That's not
to make sure I can hear you.
How do you believe that institutions, as opposed to individuals, can fight for inclusion and against dehumanization?
Such a big and good question. How can we do it? Well, by having these kinds of conversations in public places. And, the current movement against what's known as DEI is a concern of mine, because we need to have these conversations. We need to actively speak with one another about the things that are most important to life and community and individual movement. And so I would, speaking for myself, I will do this over and over again in order to bring up in our country, in our community. For example, I'm on the school board in Chesterfield, nearby here, and there are all kinds of things coming down from the federal government and the state government to suppress what's known as divisive concepts. There was actually a bill in the legislature that there are certain things we should not talk about because it might traumatize young people. Things like racial discrimination, sexual discrimination, so on and so forth. And I believe very strongly that we have to talk about those things and act upon those things. So, does that answer the question?
Yes.
Thank you.
First off, good morning. Thank you for coming. Welcome back to Dublin.
Thank you. Well, thank you. What's your name?
Will.
Thanks.
So, you kind of touched on this in your presentation. I was wondering if you could hear a little more about this. So, we've established this generational trauma. How, if it's even possible, how does one heal from generational trauma? How does a generation, how do you heal from generational trauma? Well, you can't heal, but how do you, is it acceptance?
Well, it's a really good question, and what I tried to do here is I was one of those deeply traumatized people, okay, based on what my parents, and because of their trauma, they had a hard time being good parents, and I didn't understand it as a kid, but later I figured it out. And then when I became a parent, I had a challenge to be a good parent because of the way I had been parented. So it's kind of a transgenerational line here. And I had to get to the place where I had to sort of flesh out my own trauma and work with it, learn how to do things that would allow me to heal. And that's a long story, but it's therapy, meditation, being honest, journaling, doing a lot of things that helped. This may sound a little weird, but we have a thing that we talk about in psychology and spirituality known as the sacred wound. Like we all have wounds from our childhood. By the time you're your age, everyone has something that's painful or difficult or hurts and is hard, right? So the idea is to bring it into the light and work with it so that you heal yourself and you heal each other. And it's hard work, but it's really worth it.
You feel that you've reached, I don't know, healthy is the right word, but I don't know what the word would be, like a healthy relationship with your trauma, and what does that look like?
Honestly, I think I have, and I think it was going on this trip that really closed the circle that I've been on all my life. It's sort of, since I was a kid, I was trying to figure it out, and as I said earlier, it's probably why I became a psychologist. But I think by exposing yourself with support, the kind of support we have to the trauma, it begins to heal it, and it actually becomes something that's transformative. I feel like I'm almost 75 years old, and I'm much healthier than I was when I was a kid, because I had to figure out this trauma, and it was a reality that I had no choice about the fact that who my parents were and what they experienced. But I did have a choice about living a healthy life, and I oriented myself that way. It's not easy, but it is doable. I would really encourage people to take that message from what I'm saying, that no matter what hurts, it can be exposed to others who were there to support you. Like the staff here, the teachers here, the counselor here. There are people in this world who want each of us to be healthy and thriving. So I'm here to say it's possible. Not easy, but definitely possible. Great question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Denise. So when I think about the world, and when I think about certain issues like discrimination or like certain ideologies, I think sometimes it's like too widespread that there's not a lot of ways to change it or retroact it. So like career-wise, I know that you're a psychologist, but like if you really want to make a change in the world, what would you recommend somebody to do to like have their voice heard?
Well, I used to teach a class at Keene State, and on the first day I would ask people, other than your parents, who's the most influential person in your life? I used to do this every year. What do you think they said? Other than parents?
Like their friends?
Like what
Teachers?
what profession? Teachers.
Yeah.
You got it. 9 out of 10 people. I know being a teacher is not in fashion right now. They just took apart the Department of Education at the federal level. But I think teaching, at least it's been my experience, is a noble profession. And I'm not just saying that. I had teachers when I was a kid, but kids felt like they saved my life. So, healthcare. Nurturing the environment. There's so many things, ways to make the world a better place that go beyond making money. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Hello, I'm Birdie. This adds on to Will's question, and so you said that it like closed the circle when you went and visited. Do you wish you visited before 2023, and how do you think that would have changed your perspective?
Good question. I think I would not have had as deep an experience if I hadn't had all that prep work, that international Zoom group, where I was literally talking with Germans, talking with Palestinians, talking with Israelis, talking with each other, and talking from a place of this witnessing and empathy model where you sit with somebody like we're doing right now, and you just tell your story. The other person listens. This is what happened to me when I was a kid, and this is what is hard. And you sit, the other person just sits and listens and hears it, doesn't judge it, doesn't react to it, doesn't criticize it. It's just listening, deep listening. And I think if I hadn't had that experience, I don't think I would have had as profound an experience as I did when I actually got there. So, at the same time, I think going to a place like that at any point is deeply affecting you. It's a law in Germany and Poland that every school kid has to go to Auschwitz. It's what they do. It's a significant part of their curriculum. But going there for a day as a kind of a tourist is not like going there for a week, which is what we did. But it's still important. The important thing is not to deny, as many people still do, that this actually happened. There are a lot of people, increasingly so it seems, who are trying to minimize or deny it. So I think going there, paying attention, looking, the Cohen Institute in Keene is a really great resource, by the way, for this kind of work. And it's not just focused on the Holocaust. There are other genocides in the world, unfortunately. And there's a lot of collective trauma around the world. So getting close to it, I think, is really important for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll have time afterwards if you want to talk.
Hi, so I'm Laurel. You've talked a lot about psychological effects of
Yes.
this trauma. Does it affect the gene pool at all? Does it affect
Well, that's what epigenetics are about. Has anybody have you guys studied genetics? Yeah. So epigenetics are what happens, traumatic events that actually literally are found to alter gene expression in the person. So, in other words, I believe, epigenetic effects from my parents' experience that were passed down to me. So I understand that there's a certain level of, it shows up, it used to show up in ways that are far different than the way it shows up now. But I think it does potentially change the gene pool, but not necessarily negative. Because I think, and you saw my mother, what a resilient person she is. Well, I think I got some of her resilience also, as well as her trauma. I mean, this was a person who experienced all kinds of horrible stuff, as did my father. That was passed down to me, but they also made a life here. They came here with absolutely no money and no language, and made a life and had 4 kids. I'm one of them. And I think I probably got some really good stuff from them as well. So I think that's the way it works. Thank you. See you all again. All the best to all of you. Thanks for being a really good audience.
Thank you so much, Len. He's going to be here after we finish morning meeting, before the start of E-Block, and then E-Block, he'll be in the recital hall too, so if you have that block free, or if you're in my English 12 class, come to the recital hall and you can continue the conversation.